This is a quick hit, 20 minutes of what we found in terms of our most recent research that leaders that come across from the leadership trends. So we're going to look at the top 3 that kind of bubbled up for us and want to share some of that information with you, and also share a little bit of some of a response to some of these leadership trends, which you could also call leadership challenges, that I know all of you will resonate with. So to just share with you, and some of you who were in the breakout session with me earlier today, you already know some of this information, but I do want to highlight where this research comes from. So DDI does a global leadership forecast every 2 years, and it's now a longitudinal study. So the nice thing is that we can compare every 2 years the data year over year and see what the trends are and where we see big shifts and changes. So this is a representation of about 15,000 leaders across the world that participated in the 2021 leadership forecast. I do want to just highlight real quick for you and let you know that we have another global leadership forecast that will launch in 2023, and we're getting ready to launch that. The data will come out in 2023. If your organization is interested in participating and you have enough leaders in your organization that participate in the survey, you can get a company report from this. So just something for you to think about and look into in terms of if you want some of this data that's really relevant for your organization in particular. But you can see there's a vast array of diversity. It's a global leadership forecast, so we get a lot of information and are able to diagnose that and look at the analysis and see what we want to bring to the table in terms of conversation around leadership topics that you should be paying attention to. So here are the 3 trends that I want to focus on for our conversation today. The first is the race for top talent. And none of you are surprised, I'm sure, to see that. You're seeing the churn in the workforce and people making a lot of decisions about what they want to do and where they want to be. And trying to keep pace with that for organizations is a real challenge. The second is finding potential in the virtual shadows. So you just heard the group talking about how do we figure out this hybrid workplace and how do we make it work in a way that really resonates with everybody. And part of that challenge is just the visibility, the physical visibility that maybe doesn't exist as much as it used to in the past. And then the third trend, some of you who were in the breakout earlier, you heard a little bit of this, and I'll share some additional information about how to engage our next generation of leadership. What are they looking for? How can we respond to that? And what are some of the challenges that really come into the forefront in terms of engaging next generation leaders? So let's dive into the race for top talent. So all of you are aware of the Great Resignation and have seen all the statistics. There's been a recent PwC survey that went out. This was just in the last several months. It says about 65% of people are looking for other positions, which is quite terrifying because as we all know, replacing talent is a real challenge. But really where this comes into play for organizations, there should be a higher emphasis on the retention of talent. So how to really retain leaders that are in the organization or emerging leaders who have potential for leadership positions in the future, and really continue to engage them in the organization and keep them with you. So that's really where we want to focus today. So what is leading to the Great Resignation? Like, why is this happening? Well, we talked about, you just were talking about it. It's the burnout. There is significant research that's going on right now in terms of how burnout is posing that major retention risk and how it's important for us as leaders to pay attention to that. So a couple of things that I want to highlight for you on the slide that you see here. The gray bar indicates leaders who said they are suffering from burnout. And you can see the percentage of those leaders, about 44% expect to change companies to advance, 26% expect to leave within the year. Those are really high numbers. And so all the more reason as to why it's important to pay attention to the wellness of employees and really have leaders tuned into what their employees are saying and how they need to be responsive to that. I think you heard some great discussion on the panels earlier today in addressing that topic, but this just kind of shows in numbers how significant the danger is of the burnout. The circle that I wanted to draw your attention to, the 86% of high potentials are at risk for burnout. We know those high potentials have a propensity for leadership. They're action-oriented, they want to do things, they're very responsive, but they're even more susceptible to that risk of burnout. So we have to figure out how do we address this in the workplace. So a few things that we would recommend in terms of a response to how do you keep and engage your talent and look out for the risk of burnout or try to preempt that from happening. One is to instill a sense of purpose. I think all of us in the pandemic, it was a very strange time where people got sent home and things were very different, and all of us started to think about, am I doing what is really meaningful to me? And if I'm not, now is probably the time for me to consider making a change. And so what you can do in your organization is really connect employees to the sense of purpose. How do they provide that sense of purpose in the organization and align to the strategic priorities of your organization? The second is to support leadership capabilities to recover. So one of the key leadership components that needs to be in response to this is how to delegate effectively. That's challenging when you don't have anybody to delegate to, but when you do delegate, how are you doing that? And are you not just delegating because you need places for things to go, but you're delegating with intention and purpose for development and growth. And then the last one, you've all touched on this in the last couple of panels, but keeping employee well-being front and center. One of the things that we found in our research is that employees that say their leader genuinely cares about their well-being, they're 2.5 times more likely to stay with the organization. So it's very critical that there is the ability for the leader to respond to these challenging environments that people find themselves in. The emotions are very high, and how to engage in those conversations in a really meaningful way. So not to add too much more pain to this story, but one of the other things I wanted to highlight here is that only 1 in 3 leaders are effective at building talent. So this is a real challenge in terms of you have leaders who are perhaps effectively leading in the moment, but are they leading for the future? And thinking about that risk of replacing talent and how do we continuously refresh that. So identifying talent is one of the weakest links in that pipeline of leadership, and really leaders understanding their role and how they respond to that and what they do to address replacing talent in the organization. So the last thing on this trend that I wanted to highlight was, well, what do leaders do in these times? And one of the things we recommend is that they have conversations with the people that they lead. And this ties back into our discussion that we had earlier today in the breakout room, where we were talking about authenticity and the empathy that's critical for leaders in this time, is being able to have a conversation about what's really happening with the person that you're leading. And these are some key questions that we would recommend leaders ask. They're tied to retention drivers. And a couple of key things that we would highlight for leaders as they engage in these conversations is, first of all, even asking these questions is predicated on the fact that you have built a high level of trust with the people you lead, that you have already demonstrated a care for their well-being, and that enables you to have a conversation like this. The second thing is, when you do engage in a conversation, it's about listening. It's not about trying to tell them everything's okay or why they shouldn't feel this way, but really using those empathy skills, being in that moment so you can really hear what they have to say. And that will give you more opportunity to be responsive and to figure out, how do I respond to the challenges that this person may be facing? Or maybe in that conversation, they give you a pretty good gauge that, hey, I'm really engaged, I'm not going anywhere. And then you know that okay, probably in 6 months I should check in again. So it's just about frequency of conversation and building up the level of trust so that you can ask these questions and get an honest response from the person that you're leading. So really good questions to ask there. So moving on to the second trend. So this is around finding potential, and we call it in the virtual shadows. So where do we find that potential? We talked earlier in the day, you heard on that panel, just the challenge and struggle of figuring out what is this hybrid workforce going to look like, and how is it going to operate in a way that is beneficial for the employee and for the organization, and what are the challenges that come with that? So one of the challenges that comes with that is just the fact that you don't have as much exposure, as much physical kind of interaction with the people that you lead, because you and the team that you lead might be all in different locations remotely working from home. So having the objective observation of what's happening is a real challenge. The reason that this is important, and this is one of those longitudinal things that we look at in the global leadership forecast, is the bench strength. And you can see that in 2020, the bench strength that was reported by these global organizations is at an all-time low, 11%. So all the more reason why we need leaders to be able to identify and pull talent out earlier in their career and have them exposed and have them engaged, delegate for growth and opportunity in ways that are very meaningful. You also see here that companies can fill only 47% of their leadership roles. So this was kind of the overall statistics that we saw across multiple industries and organizations. So this is why it's so critical in terms of thinking about how do we provide the skills to be able to find that potential in the hybrid working environment. That's where we come to that. I heard someone talking earlier on the panel about working in the pajamas. This is a real thing. I go to work every day in my slippers, and except for today. I did put on nice shoes for everybody today. But it really is, thinking about in that hybrid work environment, how do you have observation of information that's not just focused on performance outcomes? We know outcomes are important. We know having objectives, having key metrics in terms of measuring performance, but we know there's so much more that people bring to the table that's hard to see in just the outcome or a metric that comes from a performance objective. So the idea here is to think for leaders to think about how do they get observational data and a real understanding of what their teams are doing on a day-to-day basis, and how do they get access to that and have some observational data. The other thing is in a hybrid environment, so where you have some of your team is working full-time from home and some of your team is in the office full-time. So stripping out some of the biases that may come with that can be really challenging, and those are real things that as a leadership team in an organization should be talked about and addressed so that we can really get to those objective observations. So a few tips to think about how do you improve talent visibility. We're going to go back to old school here. So all of you HR professionals, the first thing is to clearly define profiles for success. So what are the behaviors that you really want and need to see someone demonstrate in order to be effective and have success in that role?